5 continents, 8 suspected facilities, one naval doctrine Washington spent 30 years insisting would never exist, and it's already operational. That's not a forecast. That's the current map of Chinese military logistics as of this year, assembled from satellite imagery, leaked diplomatic cables, host nation documents, and Pentagon assessments that quietly contradict every public statement made about Chinese naval ambitions since the late 1990s. For 3 decades, the consistent line from Washington was that Beijing had no interest in a global blue water navy, no capacity to sustain forces beyond its near seas, and no political appetite for the kind of overseas footprint that defines a true great power. Every one of those assumptions is now wrong. And the cost of being wrong gets paid by every American who depends on stable shipping lanes, predictable energy prices, and a global order where the United States Navy is the final word on freedom of navigation. Here's what that means at the gas pump, at the grocery store, and inside every retirement portfolio holding shipping or logistics exposure. Roughly 80% of global trade by volume moves on the ocean. The United States Navy has secured those routes since 1945. That security is not a service Washington provides out of generosity. It's the load bearing structure underneath dollar dominance, cheap consumer goods, and the pricing of nearly every commodity Americans purchase. When a second Navy starts building the infrastructure to challenge that role, not theoretically, not in white papers, but with concrete piers, fuel depots, and ammunition stores on 3 oceans, the era of unchallenged American maritime supremacy is ending, and nobody in mainstream coverage is laying out what comes next. This channel runs on no corporate funding, no defense industry contracts, and no editorial pressure telling it what to leave out. The reporting on Chinese overseas basing is fragmented across a dozen specialized outlets, classified briefings that leak in pieces, and academic journals most people never read. If a clear eyed picture of what's actually being built and why Washington is genuinely concerned in private while playing it down in public matters to the audience, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. The next phase of this story is going to move faster than the press is prepared to cover. Now for what happened. The story most people know starts in 2017 when China formally opened its first overseas military base in Djibouti, a small East African country sitting on the Bab el Mandeb Strait at the southern entrance to the Red Sea. The base was officially described as a logistics support facility for anti piracy operations and humanitarian missions. That framing held for about 2 years. Then satellite imagery began showing something the official description didn't account for: a 400-meter pier capable of berthing a Chinese aircraft carrier, hardened ammunition bunkers, expanded barracks complexes, and a layered defensive perimeter consistent with a forward deployed combat installation rather than a refueling stop. By 2020, Pentagon assessments quietly upgraded Djibouti from logistics facility to expeditionary base. The public messaging never changed. The internal classification did. Then came Ream. Ream Naval Base sits on the Gulf of Thailand on Cambodia's southern coast, and for years Cambodian officials denied any Chinese military involvement at the site. Western journalists and satellite analysts documented Chinese construction crews, Chinese funded pier expansions, and the demolition of U.S. built facilities that had previously hosted joint exercises. By 2023, multiple government assessments confirmed what the imagery already showed. Ream now hosts dedicated berthing for Chinese naval vessels, and the layout of the new pier mirrors the dimensions used at Chinese mainland bases for specific frigate and destroyer classes. Cambodia continues to deny it's a Chinese base. The concrete tells a different story. That's 2 confirmed facilities. The list of suspected and emerging sites is significantly longer. Equatorial Guinea on the Atlantic coast of Africa, assessed by U.S. intelligence as a likely future Chinese naval facility, which would put Chinese warships within striking distance of the American eastern seaboard for the first time in history. The United Arab Emirates, where construction at a port near Abu Dhabi was paused in 2021 after American pressure but reportedly resumed quietly under a different cover designation. Solomon Islands, where a 2022 security pact gave Beijing the legal framework to deploy security forces with port access provisions that defense analysts read as a soft basing arrangement. Pakistan's Gwadar Port, Sri Lanka's Hambantota, Tanzania's Bagamoyo, Kiribati's Canton Island, each one denied as a military facility by the host government, each one showing dual-use patterns that make the denial mathematically implausible. The official story from Beijing has remained constant throughout. China does not seek overseas military bases. China's overseas presence is purely commercial and defensive. China respects the sovereignty of all nations and does not project power. The operational reality shows the opposite. The pattern is too consistent to be commercial coincidence. Deep water ports capable of berthing major naval combatants, fuel storage exceeding any conceivable civilian demand, runway extensions that match military aviation specifications, and security perimeters built to military rather than commercial standards. When 8 facilities across 3 oceans all happen to share these features, the explanation that they're just port investments stops being credible. Here's what they're not telling you about the engineering. A commercial port designed for container shipping has very specific requirements. Shallow draft is fine for most vessels. Pier loading is calibrated for cranes and stacking equipment. Fuel storage is sized for diesel needed by visiting cargo ships. A port designed to support naval operations looks different in measurable ways. The water depth needs to handle warships drawing significantly more than container vessels. The pier surface needs to handle the point loads of weapons elevators and ammunition handling equipment. The fuel storage needs to include marine gas turbine fuel, not just diesel. The communications infrastructure needs hardened lines and satellite uplinks that no commercial operator would pay for. Every one of the 8 suspected Chinese facilities shows at least 3 of these naval specific signatures. Several show all of them. And here is the dimension almost nobody is discussing. The most strategically significant element of the Chinese basing network isn't the bases themselves, it's the geographic logic connecting them. Look at the map. Djibouti at the Red Sea entrance, Gwadar at the Arabian Sea, Hambantota in the Central Indian Ocean, Bagamoyo on the East African coast, the proposed Equatorial Guinea facility on the Atlantic, the Solomon Islands and Kiribati positions in the South Pacific. What they form when connected is a logistics chain that allows the Chinese Navy to sustain operations along the entire Indo-Pacific maritime corridor and into the Atlantic. It's not a basing strategy aimed at any single conflict. It's the construction of a global naval logistics system, the kind only one country has historically possessed. And that country is not in Asia. Now zoom out to the larger pattern. Naval power doesn't actually live in ships. It lives in the ability to keep ships at sea, fuel them, repair them, rearm them, rotate their crews, and replace damaged vessels without surrendering operational tempo. The United States Navy operates roughly 800 overseas military installations of various sizes, with a core of about 40 major facilities that form the backbone of global American maritime reach. That network was built across 80 years, anchored by alliance structures forged in the aftermath of the Second World War, sustained by trillions of dollars of cumulative defense spending, and protected by a political consensus that lasted through 12 administrations of both parties. China is now constructing, in compressed timeframes and through financial leverage rather than military victory, a parallel system. The architecture is different, the function is converging. Here is the math, and the math is brutal. The United States operates approximately 11 nuclear powered aircraft carriers. China operates 3 carriers, with 2 more under construction and a 6th reportedly in the design phase. By raw hull count, the comparison still favors Washington. But the United States Navy has fallen below 300 deployable battle force ships for the first time in modern memory, while the Chinese People's Liberation Army Navy now operates over 340 surface combatants and submarines and is on track to reach 400 by the end of this decade. Read those numbers again. The American fleet is shrinking. The Chinese fleet is growing. The crossover already happened on hull count. The capability gap is closing on every metric except carrier aviation, and that gap narrows every year. The shipbuilding capacity asymmetry is even starker. China's commercial and military shipbuilding industry now produces more tonnage in a single year than the United States produces in a decade. The largest Chinese state-owned shipbuilder has more than 200 times the production capacity of the largest American naval shipbuilder. 200 times. That is not a typo. The American defense industrial base for warship construction has consolidated to the point where a single major program delay can ripple through the entire fleet replacement schedule, while China can launch a new destroyer roughly every 3 to 4 months from a single yard. When losses accumulate in any sustained naval engagement, the side that can replace ships faster wins by attrition alone. The American replacement rate currently cannot keep pace with planned retirements. The Chinese replacement rate exceeds planned expansion. The basing math compounds the shipbuilding math. A naval vessel can stay on station on average for a duration limited by fuel, food, ammunition, and crew endurance. With a network of forward bases, that duration extends dramatically because resupply and rotation become possible without returning to home waters. Without forward bases, a navy can build all the ships it wants and still be unable to project sustained force at distance. For decades, this was the structural ceiling on Chinese naval ambition. Beijing could build, but Beijing could not sustain. The basing network being assembled right now removes that ceiling. Every new facility extends the range and duration of Chinese naval operations by orders of magnitude. And the cost to China per facility is a fraction of what equivalent infrastructure costs Washington, because most of the construction is funded through Belt and Road loans that the host country technically owes back. That financing model is itself a strategic weapon. The pattern repeats across nearly every host nation. China extends infrastructure loans on commercial terms that local officials accept eagerly. Construction proceeds, repayment becomes difficult. Restructuring negotiations begin. The terms of restructuring frequently include extended port leases, security cooperation agreements, or access provisions that were never part of the original conversation. Hambantota in Sri Lanka is the textbook case, a commercial port that was leased to a Chinese state owned enterprise for 99 years after Sri Lanka could not service the underlying debt. The lease is officially commercial. The strategic effect is the conversion of a third country port into a Chinese controlled deep water facility on the central Indian Ocean shipping lane. That is not aid. That is not investment. That is the financialization of geography. And it works because the alternative on offer, Western development financing, has been hollowed out by 20 years of underinvestment, slow disbursement, and political conditionality that recipient countries find insulting. Now, here is what makes Washington genuinely concerned in language the public briefings carefully avoid. A network of overseas Chinese naval facilities does three things simultaneously. First, it forces the United States to plan for naval contingencies across multiple oceans rather than concentrating on the Pacific theater alone. Every American carrier strike group that has to monitor a potential Chinese deployment in the Indian Ocean or the Atlantic is one that cannot be masked for a Taiwan or South China Sea scenario. Second, it gives Beijing the credible ability to interdict commercial shipping it doesn't like, which fundamentally changes the leverage equation in every future confrontation involving any country dependent on maritime trade. Third, and most importantly, it normalizes the presence of Chinese military forces in regions where the United States has been the only external military actor for 2 generations. Once that presence is normalized, the political cost to host nations of accepting deeper Chinese military activity drops further. The first base is the hardest. The eighth is routine. The Russia angle here is quieter than the China story, but reinforces it. Russia has been quietly cooperating with Chinese naval deployments in the Pacific for several years now, conducting joint exercises in the Sea of Japan, joint air patrols in the Pacific, and joint maritime operations that demonstrate operational interoperability between the two militaries. Moscow gains by tying down American attention on a second front. Beijing gains by acquiring operational experience working with a navy that has decades of cold water and high latitude expertise the Chinese fleet still lacks. Neither country needs to announce a formal alliance for the practical effect to be the same. Washington must now plan for the possibility that any future Pacific contingency involves coordinated Chinese Russian naval action, and that coordination is being practiced openly. The Russian Pacific Fleet is a shadow of what it was during the Cold War, but it doesn't need to be more than a complicating factor to materially raise the cost of any American intervention scenario. The Global South angle is even more important and even less covered. From the perspective of a government in sub Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, the Pacific Islands, or the Caribbean, the offer on the table from Beijing is straightforward: financing without political conditions, infrastructure on accelerated timelines, and the kind of recognition that the Western diplomatic system has historically rationed to nations that play by its rules. The offer from Washington is alliance protection that frequently arrives with audits, human rights conditionality, and lectures about governance. For decades, the latter offer was the only one available, so it functioned as a monopoly. Now there is a competitor, and the competitor is winning the bidding war for influence in exactly the geographic choke points that determine maritime power. This is not a story about ideology. It is a story about market dynamics in the global influence economy, and the American product has become uncompetitive in important segments. The dollar dimension underneath all of this should worry anyone tracking the long-term trajectory of American financial dominance. Naval supremacy is not separate from monetary supremacy. The reason the dollar has functioned as the global reserve currency for 8 decades is partly because the United States Navy has guaranteed the maritime trade that requires dollar settlement. As that guarantee softens, and it softens the moment a credible second power can challenge access to specific waterways, the underlying logic for holding dollars softens with it. China has spent the past several years building yuan-denominated commodity markets, central bank swap lines, and alternative payment systems that can route around dollar-based infrastructure. Each of those efforts gains traction in proportion to how credibly Beijing can offer security to the trade routes denominated in yuan. The naval-based network is, among other things, a monetary policy instrument. It is the physical infrastructure of a monetary alternative. Here's what the evidence indicates about where this goes from here. 3 predictions with timeframes attached. First, within the next 18 to 24 months, at least one additional Chinese overseas facility will be officially confirmed by either Western intelligence assessments or by host nation acknowledgement under domestic political pressure. The most likely candidates are Equatorial Guinea, the United Arab Emirates location, or a Pacific island nation that has not yet entered the public conversation. The pattern is too far advanced for the dam not to break somewhere. Second, within 36 months, there will be a public incident, a freedom of navigation operation, a naval close encounter, or a contested transit through a strait, in which Chinese naval forces operating from one of these forward bases compel the United States Navy to back down or modify its operational plan. The exact location is not predictable. The fact that such an incident is now structurally possible is the news. Every time it happens without escalation, the precedent of Chinese forward presence becomes more entrenched. Third, within 5 to 7 years, the term American naval supremacy will have become a contested phrase in serious foreign policy discourse rather than a default assumption, not because any single battle will have been fought, but because the cumulative weight of basing, shipbuilding, and presence will have shifted the practical balance of probabilities in any given regional scenario. Washington will continue to claim primacy. Allies will quietly hedge. The hedge is what matters. What burns slowly in this story is not infrastructure. It is the assumption, held confidently across both American political parties for 30 years, that the post 1945 maritime order was permanent and self sustaining. That assumption is now being tested for the first time, and the early returns are not encouraging for the side that built the existing order. The basing network being assembled right now is the physical proof that Chinese strategic patience has translated into capability that will outlast any single administration in either capital. And the longer this story stays out of mainstream conversation, the more advanced the structural shift becomes before it gets debated as policy. So here's the question. Drop the prediction in the comments. Which of the three above happens first? Public confirmation of a new base, a Chinese-American naval standoff that forces Washington to back down, or the moment when serious analysts stop calling American naval primacy a settled fact? Pick one and explain the reasoning. The comment section on these videos has consistently produced sharper analysis than most of what gets published in foreign policy journals, and the question of timing matters because timing determines policy windows. If this provided a framework for understanding what the daily headlines fragment into noise, share it with one person who needs to see how the pieces connect. The story of Chinese naval expansion is not going to slow down. The next video traces the financing chain underneath the basing network, who is actually paying for what, who carries the risk when it unravels, and the specific debt instruments that turn ports into leverage. Subscribe so that one lands in the feed when it drops. The map is being redrawn. Most people will only notice when it is already finished.